Hello! All right, let's get started. All right, it is chapter 12 or week 12 of this series, which means that we are coming close to the end, considering that there's only about, what, 16 weeks in this? So we're going to sit around and talk about stress this week. So the main topics are stress, coping, and health. And yeah, either you're watching this live or you're watching this on YouTube. Either way, it's cool because I don't take attendance and there are no tests in this class. Just like when I really taught this class at an actual university. So let's get started. So stress. What is stress? How do we define stress? It's basically any form of tension or discomfort that a person experiences. It's originally an engineering term that psychologists thought was really cool, so they decided that they were going to take it and be like, and say, yes, this is ours now. Because it works, and it works very well for talking about the kinds of experiences that we go through in our daily lives. So what is something that causes us stress? Well, it's a stress or. So in the original context, when we're thinking about engineering stress, we're thinking about the different forces that might act on a structure to maybe cause damage over time or erode its structural integrity. So maybe you've got stuff like compressive stress, aka gravity, that thing that holds us all down. You might have tensile stress, which is just, is something being bent or pulled on consistently. You have shear stress that might be caused, if you build a tall building, might be caused by just the wind, or maybe it was built on uneven ground. All these factors come together into the engineering equation, and you have to really think about how you might be able to account for these if you want your structure to keep standing for a long time. And if you're like me, you probably want to be able to manage stress well in your life so that you too can be standing for a long time. And apart from these factors, these are kind of chronic factors. But like, what if someone comes over and let's say you built a building, and somebody throws a rock at it, let's say through a window, and it breaks. You can account for that. You can try to anticipate something like that, but ultimately, like, someone coming up and throwing a rock through a window of your building is an isolated event. It's not a systematic thing that is happening all the time, like gravity. So there are different kinds of stressors that we experience in our lives, much like how engineers have to account for both long-term stressors as well as isolated individual events like a punk kid throwing a rock. Now, when we think about this again, there are a lot of different ways we think to talk about stress. And you've probably heard the term, trauma or traumatic event at some point. In the stress literature, we think about trauma as being the result of exposure to a severe stressor. That is something that might be a long-term event. Maybe you're stuck in a difficult household. Poverty is a outstanding example of a stressor that has long-term consequences for people throughout their lives. But it can also be an isolated event. Maybe you caused a car accident or were involved in a car accident, or had maybe the death of a family member or someone that you were close to. Those are isolated events, but they can still be severe stressors, just like long-term events like in poverty or dealing with maybe something in childhood malnutrition or something like that. Those are more long-term effects, but can still produce consequences in the long term, up to and including post-traumatic stress disorder. So how do we, again, appraise stress? So this is keeping this in the psychological perspective. Well, we think about a stressor, the thing that's causing stress, as a stimuli. And that's just a situation or a thing that is in our environment that is causing stress. And that can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing, it can be a long-term thing, it can be an isolated thing. The examples that I like here are a wedding versus a divorce. They're actually both stressors for different reasons. You think about a wedding, it's a good thing. It's supposed to be a happy occasion, it's a celebration, it's a big party, there's a large cake. Sometimes you invite that your cool VTubing professor, and she maybe has one drink too many at the reception. But it's still a stressful event with the planning and the organizing and all that, even if it's positive overall. In a divorce, typically people think of as a negative event or a sad event, and it is still a stressor, all the same. Now, stress, again, is the response. So we have a combination of physiological and physical reactions, as well as psychological reactions to stress. And those can be measured in a range of different ways. We can ask somebody how they're feeling. Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you feeling stressed as an emotional state? You can measure someone's heart rate. You can also look at different hormones. In particular, cortisol is a hormone that is typically associated with a stress response. People that have a high concentration or a high amount of cortisol in their bodies tend to experience more stress than the average person. Now, this is maybe a TMI story, but I have a fun anecdote about hormones as well. So after I finished my doctorate, in the last year of my PhD, I came out as trans. I started transitioning. At the time, I was engaged to someone who ultimately dumped me because of my transition. And if you know anything about being trans, frequently, especially in the early phases of the process, you typically have to go in for regular blood work to just make sure that your hormone levels are staying where they should be and things are within safe ranges. But that, for me, kind of created a very interesting chart because I was taking testosterone blockers. And you could see the line was going down for a while, and then there was an identifiable spot where it started ticking back up. And my doctor saw that and said, all right, we're gonna up your blockers, they're not working anymore. And up into the point where I was taking the maximum dose that they would give me. And yet that line kept going up. And eventually they were just like, hands up in the air, I don't know what to do with you, your body's weird. But then I sat down with a nurse at some point, not the doctor, but just a nurse. And we're going over this, we're talking about how, my hormone panels are weird, we don't really know what to do with it. And she just looks at me and says, what's going on in your life? What's actually happening to you? And I said, well, I just finished my doctorate and I'm really struggling on the job market. I've been unemployed for a couple months and my money is running out. And, my family hasn't been really kind to me. And so I don't really have a place I can go if I go broke. And my fiance left me, and I kept going on. And I just saw her face shift because she understood what was really happening. Because it turns out, and I learned by experience, that it's not just cortisol that is produced by the body when you're stressed. It's also testosterone. So have you ever wondered, why do people go bald or lose their hair when they're stressed out? It's because their bodies actually kick up the production of testosterone, at least in part because their bodies are kicking up the production of testosterone. So that's why people that are experiencing chronic stress also lose their hair, kind of like people that have higher than average levels of testosterone. Kind of goofy, right? Kind of funny. Bodies are weird and hormones are weirder. So it's something I know from experience. I didn't know until that point that our bodies produce very identifiable patterns of hormones and hormonal releases in response to stress. And apart from just the sort of the black box in out of stressor produces stress, there's also a transactional element to how we experience stress. How we interpret and cope with potential stressors matters a lot for how stressed we actually get. So it turns out that we have different kinds of experiences. We might have a primary appraisal, when we encounter something of, is it threatening? Am I in danger? Versus a secondary appraisal. Can I cope with the thing? Do I have the resources to deal with that? And then that even further breaks down into problem-focused versus emotion-focused coping. Let's say you've got a test in the morning, and you're like, well, that's the problem. Well, you can maybe avoid that stressor by not going to the test. There you go. You remove the problem. Or you can maybe do emotion-focused coping and deal with the stressor by having prepared, having bolstered up your resources, studied a lot so that you feel confident. And so instead of trying to remove the stressor, you've changed the way that you deal with it in order to get over the hurdle that the stressor is proposing to you. But let's bring up another fun example of this. Let's just say, for example, you're in the woods, you're camping, and you encounter some bears. You're walking around, and there's a bear there. It is frightening. It is large, and you know what? You can try to remove yourself from the situation because you appraise the situation. You say, yes, this is threatening. Yes, I am in danger. I am going to remove myself from the situation as best I can. Emotion-focused coping is maybe not the best fit for that situation. But what about the death of a family member? You have your primary appraisal and you say, is this threatening? Am I in danger? Maybe not. But in terms of the emotional impact of that loss, that's a different matter. And you might start to think about, well, this is hard. Maybe you've lost a parent, something along those lines. And you think, well, do I have social support? Do I have the ability to kind of process and deal with these emotions? Maybe there's a financial element. Your parent dies, funerals are expensive. Are you going to be able to afford this? There's all these different factors that can come up. And this is, again, less of a primary stressor. It's not directly threatening, but it's still a stressor nonetheless. So there's a lot of history with how people have measured stress over the many years. And one of the ways that I kind of like is the social readjustment rating scale, which has been in use since the 1960s. And it's basically a pre-tested list of stressful events. That is to say that they went to people and they said, you know what? Here's a list of things. We want you to tell us, how stressful do you think this thing is? And in order to administer it, a person just checks off what they've experienced. Higher numbers are associated with more negative outcomes. So let's take a look at this actually. Let's go over. And we're here. All right. Here is the actual social readjustment rating scale. It's a 43-item measure. Its reliability, as you can see, it was validated back in 1967. Found a positive correlation between life change scores and illness, so people were rating their own health. They looked at, okay, as stress goes up, is there a correlation with health scores? And yeah, turns out there is. It's a relatively small correlation, but it's there. According to how it's scored, basically, there are differences in individual coping abilities, but the general guidelines break down, and if you have 150 or less, you're probably experiencing a low level of stress. 150 to 299, 300 or more, and so on and so forth. Breaking down into trying to give a diagnostic prognosis, saying that, if you have a lot of shit going on in your life, a lot of stress, well then a person might be at risk of developing a stress-related disorder, and we'll cover some of those in a little bit. So if we scroll down a little bit more, we can see what this actually looks like. A person goes through and they just rate it and they tally up and they keep track of the number of things that they have to deal with. So the death of a spouse, big impact, 100 points right there. So you're already almost there into the sort of the moderate category if you've experienced the death of a spouse. Then you have things like divorce, marital separation, being fired at work, marital reconciliation, a marriage. Again, what I like about this scale and what it illustrates that you can have a lot of stress coming from generally positive events in your life. Getting married, cool, awesome. Most people are happy about it. It is still a relatively stressful event. There's 50 points there in the big old stress scale. You also have stuff like retirement. Can be good, but it's still a big life change. And then we have stuff like pregnancy, gaining a new family member, having debt, something like a mortgage, or a change in your financial state, change in your responsibilities at work, that could even include being promoted, trouble with in-laws, moving, so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting about this, and as I was getting ready to give this talk, I sat back and I was like, all right, well, let's think about this in the context of the past couple of years, right? In public stress and public health. Well, as you might know, the year is 2022 and the year of our Lord and Savior, Luigi Mario. And we've got a pandemic that we're all living through. So thinking about stuff like the change in health of a family member, maybe your responsibilities change at work. Maybe you know someone that's gotten sick. Maybe you've lost a friend or a family member. All these different factors, changes in living conditions. You've had to move. You aren't able to do the hobbies that you like to do anymore. You had a change in your social activities, and so on and so on and so on. What this really breaks down to, if you want to put this in a contemporary point, we all deal with a lot of stress all the time. And even things that seem kind of minor can still add up into being like bigger issues over time. We call these hassles. And so minor annoyances that just strain our ability to cope still add up over time. I mean, stuff like getting stuck in traffic, forgetting your lunch at home, even minor stuff, getting disconnected on a phone call, having audio issues on your stream. They're not big life events. They're small, discrete events that usually have clear solutions. And yet, they still add up and they strain our coping resources and maybe give us less ability to cope with bigger things when they do happen. So, this is again the SRRS, but I wanted to break it down into a bigger point because this is honestly very difficult to read. So, moving on, how do we understand the mechanics of stress? Well, one theory, and one that I like, is that there is an identifiable pattern to how we deal with stress that falls under the general adaptation syndrome, or GAS. So in GAS, there are 3 stages for how we deal with stress. Initially, we have a state of alarm. We have an excitation of the automatic nervous system. This is, again, the same part of the body and the same part of our neurological mechanisms that is associated with the flight or flight response. And it reacts the same way. We have a release of corticosteroids, we have adrenaline, we're ready to go. Now, what's interesting about this, again, if we want to break this down into, say, the wonderful world of evolutionary psychology, which I think I've gone over, I have difficult feelings about, but we have evolved this system of alarm and this fight or flight response that seems like it's better tuned for scary, threatening situations. It's better tuned for the bear than it is for the death of the parent or the family member. We have this excitation that we have, this release of energy, and that can be helpful for removing yourself from a physically threatening situation, but maybe isn't super helpful if you're trying to cope with a more difficult emotional problem. Well, over time, we then employ our coping strategies through resistance. We go through our alarm state, and then we try to bring ourselves back down. And that's how we respond to stress. However, sometimes resistance isn't able to solve the problem, and we hit a point of exhaustion. And our coping breaks down, the activation bottoms out, kind of like how a building can only deal with so much stress before it collapses. The same is true of people. You know, if you've ever been, like me, and maybe you're stressed out at work or anything like that, you're trying to go to sleep and you're just like, your mind is racing, you have all this energy, you're in that alarm state, you don't know how to cope and bring yourself back down, but you still fall asleep eventually because your body can only be in that state of excitation, in that state of alarm, for so long before it just kind of bottoms out and you run out of energy. You only got so much gas in the tank. Visually, this is what it looks like. We see something, we go into a state of shock, our body activates, gets ready to go, our fight or flight response activates, our coping mechanisms kick in, we try to calm ourselves down, and if we aren't able to do that, we eventually bottom out into exhaustion. Now, what does that actually look like, though, over time? So this is, I'm going to put a CW here. It's the big old content warning. You might want to skip ahead past this slide if you're watching this in the archive. If you're not comfortable with some maybe less than ethical studies involving dogs. So that said, learned helplessness is an interesting concept in psychology. And it's something that some grad students kind of stumbled upon while they were working on studies in classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So what they tried to do is put dogs in situations where they were standing on an electrified floor, where if the light dimmed, it was to warn of an impending shock, that the floor was going to be electrified and zap the dog's paws. And eventually the dogs would learn to move to the other side of the room if the light dimmed. You know, it's the classical conditioning experiment. Now, here's the thing though. By happenstance, at one point, they started putting dogs in situations, happenstance, where they couldn't escape the situation. They just kept getting shocked. And the dogs they would try to leave, they would try to panic, they would panic and try to get out of the situation. But eventually what they found is that the dogs kind of gave up after a while. If they weren't able to remove themselves from the situation, eventually they just stopped trying. And learned helplessness has been implicated in people as a contributing factor to clinical depression. If you're experiencing long-term, intense bouts of stress and you just can't bring yourself out of it, eventually you hit that point of exhaustion. You can't really cope with it. You're not able to remove yourself from the situation, and so you kind of just deal with it. We'll talk about this more as we get into the clinical psychology chapter in a couple of lessons, but it's relevant to introduce here as a way of like how we really navigate stress and what happens if we can't cope with what's happening around us. How do we deal with that kind of situation? Turns out that in a lot of cases, people just sort of learn to deal, or they just habituate to the consistent stressor, and there's long-term consequences for that, particularly in people's health. So the immune system is our general defense against illness-inducing organisms and substances. We got skin, we got white blood cells, and all these work together in tandem to keep us healthy. And this can be compromised via a range of disorders, especially acquired immune deficiency syndrome or AIDS, but it can also be compromised by stress. And we know that high levels of stress in the past year make a person more susceptible to illness, and particularly stuff like colds or the flu, etc. People that are living with lots of isolated events or just have long-term high-stress jobs or positions or just a lot going on in their lives are more likely to get sick because our immune system is suppressed by the amount of stress that we are experiencing day in and day out. Again, I wrote these slides back in like 2017, 2018, and I've been updating them as I go. This one really hit me, particularly in the context of COVID. Remember, think back to that, how we measure different events. A lot of times, big sources of stress are just changes in our daily schedules. And, I don't know about y'all, but, going to full-time work from home, going into situations where I'm not leaving the house for days on end, I'm not seeing a lot of my friends for now going on, going into a third year of doing that? It's stressful. It's hard. And then you add in the ambient stress of knowing that that's also probably compromising my immune system or making me more likely to get sick, and it's a pretty awful combination. And there are a number of identifiable stress-related illnesses, and these are authentic illnesses, real illnesses, people get sick, that are produced or maintained by stress. We call this a psychophysiological interaction. Psycho meaning psychology, physio meaning physical. So you think about ulcers, right? That's the one that most people go to when you think about stress. It's an infection or a wearing away of usually somewhere in the digestive system, usually around the stomach. It's caused by bacteria, but stress may contribute. Your immune system is suppressed, which means that those ulcer-causing bacteria have an easier time setting up shop in your stomach or in your intestine and causing that painful sore. Other things, even more serious things like coronary heart disease, are connected to stress, among other things. But stress and having a type A personality are also connected there. So when we think about a lot of illnesses, it's best to take a psychosocial perspective. Psychosocial, our physical, our psychological, and our social situations all contribute and blend together to have a big and very real impact on our health and healthiness going in our day-to-day lives. So how do we actually cope with stress? What does that really mean? Well, there's a lot of different ways of coping. On one hand, you can have social support. That's a huge factor, social support. Having intimate friends or large groups of people that you're able to talk to or or just interact with does a tremendous, tremendous good for people in terms of being able to cope with stressful situations. And a big part of that is emotional. If you have someone that you can talk to, and even if it's just someone saying, well, that sucks. Sorry. that can still help people feel better about themselves. It's kind of a weird novelty, right? You wouldn't think that something that small can have a measurable impact on a person's health, but it can. And having networks of people that you connect with can also give you information, can help you get access to financial resources. I see this a lot, so I do a lot of volunteering now with my local trans community, and I see all this happening in real time. It's like between mutual aid networks where people will, offer emotional support, but also maybe someone gets laid off and the community pitches together to maybe cover their rent for a period of time. Or people that are trying to figure out how to go about them. Maybe they're trying to come out at work. They're saying, I'm trans, I want to come out at work. I don't know what legal protections I have. Well, then they might be able to get information from people that have also gone through that process. So social support, just being connected to other people, does a lot to help us deal with and cope with these stressors that we encounter day in and day out. Outside of that, another major factor here is just gaining control. Are you able to either gain perceived control or actual control in a situation? So thinking back to that bear, well, odds are I'm not going to have a lot of perceived control in that situation if I'm camping and I encounter a bear. However, I might be able to remove myself from the situation, I may be able to run away, and then I have some actual control over what happens. You can further break this down into stuff like behavioral control. Do you have a course of action that you can take? Cognitive control, changing the way that you're interpreting the situation. Decisional control, reframing the situation as a choice that you can make. Informational control, just learning about it. Or emotional control, expressing or suppressing your emotions. I haven't stopped for a bit. I know I've been kind of chugging through this, but just checking out here. Does anyone have any questions at all? I know yeah, it's a good point. So like maybe you find out that the bear has been trained, or the bear has maybe it's just habituated to people and the bear is less frightening. Maybe it's Yogi Bear and it's just smarter than the average bear and only wants your picnic basket. That would give you a reframing of the situation that would allow you to exert some level of control, even if it's just knowing more about the situation that you're in. So all these factors, again, come together, and they're not mutually exclusive. So for example, what's a good one here? Let's go back to my personal example there. I'm trans, my hormones are out of control. What can I do? Well, I might go online. I might go to Reddit or something, and maybe I just learn more about how hormones work and all that. And that gives me some knowledge, some information that I can use. And by knowing more about the situation, I might just feel better about it in general. It's there's a running joke that trans people tend to teach each other endocrinology, and it's not totally not untrue. Also true like of other things like behavioral points of being able to just again do something about it. Even if I go to my doctor and they can't do anything or they don't know what to do, booking that appointment might help me feel better. Yeah, that's another good observation there, that it's like the more you know about a situation, it can help you prevent ruminating, where you just kind of build up the situation in your head and you're sort of spinning your own wheels and just stressing yourself out more. Because remember, stress is a transactional piece too. There's the stressor, there's sort of the biological response we have, but if we're sitting down and I'm just sitting around and I'm just, thinking about how stressed I am, or personally, I tend to carry my tension in my shoulders. And when it gets bad enough that I can feel it and I can just know that I'm stressed, that is gonna make me feel more stressed already. It just compounds. And so when you get yourself in those kind of spirals where you're just kind of stressed about being stressed, then it all starts to get really messy really quickly. Yeah. That's another good example. Like maybe you're getting stressed out in a video game and you're not sure what the solution is to a problem, but then you go look it up and you find out what you can do in that situation, and then it's not as scary anymore. You don't have that same visceral reaction to it. All right, let's go on. So here's the classic, right? Like the punching a pillow, the catharsis response. Does it work? This is a question I got all the time from students. Does punching a pillow work? Well, the answer is no. Well, not really. The punching the pillow is not actually, if it does help you, it's usually not in the long term, and it's usually not because you punch the pillow. What ends up happening more often, actually, is that like what we call the catharsis effect, there's a temporary release, maybe, probably coming from an increase in perceived control. But in the long term, over time, here's the shitty part. You can end up bringing up other emotions that you weren't necessarily aware of. And then you have to deal with those emotions. And so punching the pillow just made you realize how frustrated you actually were. And now it's an even bigger problem that you have to solve. Also, and even if that doesn't happen, it doesn't actually remove the stressor or change your response to it. Any relief is temporary. The only ways that catharsis ever really leads to real reductions in stress over time is if it's connected to problem solving or a constructive effort. You know, if you're stressed about the exam, or let's say I'm teaching this class in person at a university, and I give a student a bad grade. Did poorly on a test, I'm sorry, but you didn't do well. And they go home and they're mad at me, they're mad at themselves, and then because they didn't study for the exam, and now they're frustrated because they no longer can get enough points to get an A in the class, and they start punching the pillow. The pillow might give them an outlet for that temporary frustration, but it doesn't actually solve the source of the problem. And that's really the issue with catharsis. So there are individual differences in how people cope. So hardiness is one just individual factor. It's a set of attitudes. We can generally call it resilience. And people that tend to view changes as a challenge or believe, again, coming back to control and perceived control, people that believe that they can do better, that they can overcome a challenge or an obstacle, those people tend to be very resilient. They tend to be better at coping. We've also got, the issues of optimism. People tend to be that are optimistic, again, coming back to perceived control, tend to be better at coping. There's also some research suggesting that higher levels of religiosity tend to also contribute to coping, but there are also some confounds that make it tricky to interpret. For example, if you're very religious and you're a part of a church group, you also probably have a lot of social support. So is it really the religiosity, or is it the fact that you're going to spend time with people and you have shared resources and mutual support from your church? It's all messy and confounded, but it's worth mentioning. So what does an effective coping strategy look like? Well, it has to be flexible, because the things that we deal with day in and day out come at us from different directions. They have different shapes. Some of them are going to have different levels of our ability to control, and having more tools available to you, it gives you a better chance of matching the correct tool to the situation that you're in. Now, there is some folk wisdom out there, kind of the opposite of catharsis, that if you're feeling bad, if you're feeling stressed, just simply try not to be stressed. Don't feel those feelings. But it's tricky, because suppressing emotions often tends to backfire, and can sometimes lead to rumination. It's or even in some cases, help us avoid rumination in the short term, but maybe we don't necessarily avoid it in the long term. So that's kind of what came up in an earlier comment here, where you have a situation and then you go and you learn more information about it, and that helps you from just ruminating and building it up in your brain. But if you're in a situation, let's say, you've got a looming deadline and you can't work on the thing, well, if you keep thinking about it, you keep ruminating on it, you build it up. And again, you get back to that transactional part of stress. You get stressed about being stressed. You start to spiral. And that's what we call rumination. where you keep kind of spinning your wheels and you're not necessarily, removing yourself from the situation or doing anything that's going to be productive at getting yourself to a healthier place, but you just keep doing it. But for people that are better at just accepting circumstances and finding positive ways of dealing with them, they tend to be the best at coping. They can deal with it, they can find positive ways to deal with the stress that they encounter, but honestly, that's easier said than done. But there is a whole world out there of health-focused psychology. So we call this, understandably, health psychology, which is a whole subfield dedicated to trying to promote, maintain healthy behaviors and to prevent and treat illnesses. Because remember, if we're thinking that psychology has a actual real measurable effect in whether or not people are sick, how long they are sick, well then it makes sense to try to examine the psychology behind that. One area that I'm fairly familiar with via my graduate education is information avoidance, which is, as you would expect, a branch of psychology, particularly health psychology, that is interested in why do people avoid information, specifically health information. So you might be the kind of person, let's say you live in California, you live in Southern California, and you want to go, and you're in the sun a lot, you're always on the beach, it's great, the weather's perfect, everything's awesome. Do you want to get screened for skin cancer? Or maybe you get screened for skin cancer and the doctor calls you and says, hey, we want you to come in and discuss your results. Some people would avoid that appointment. They don't want to know whether or not they have skin cancer. This is also big for, let's say, contemporary example, COVID testing. You're feeling kind of crummy, you got a headache, you got a little bit of congestion, but it's December, it's flu season. You're not sure if you want to go get tested to find out if you have COVID. There are people out there that would avoid getting tested because of, according to the information avoidance theory and framework, well, three main reasons. One, it would challenge their beliefs about themselves, or importantly in this case, it would actually obligate them to do something. Let's actually jump over here to the actual paper. Whoop. And there we go. Actual paper on information avoidance. So why do people avoid information? And it's like, generally, there are individual differences in this, uncertainty, coping styles, etc. How we have our coping resources, our expectations. So like, again, if you've been out in the sun all the time and your doctor says, I want to screen you for skin cancer, you might say no because you expect that it might come back that you have maybe early stage skin cancer, or you're afraid of finding out. Now, why might that be? Well, you might not feel like you're able to actually deal with that right now. Maybe you're going through a bunch of other life stress and you don't want to add one more thing to it. After all, you're healthy right now, you feel fine. Why would you do something that might jeopardize that? It also might obligate you to act. You might have to go and do something that you don't want to do. It might also threaten your belief that you are a healthy person. Now, extrapolating it to COVID, if you find out that you have COVID, let's say you have a vacation planned next week, and you're feeling a little bit crummy, just a little bit under the weather, you might avoid getting a COVID test because, well, regulating emotions, it would be upsetting. You'd be bummed. It would just suck. And so you don't want to do it. And after all, like, you feel kind of healthy, maybe it's just a cold, it's not necessarily COVID. Maybe you avoid getting tested. Also, if you get tested and you have COVID and it's positive, you're going to feel obligated to cancel that vacation. You're going to feel like you need to do things. You're going to have to quarantine. You're going to have to do all these things. You have to notify people that you're in touch with. And that might be just too much work for some people. Also, again, it might threaten your beliefs that you're a healthy person and you don't have COVID. And that might be enough for some people. This is pulling from the original Sweeney article. But it's an interesting framework. Like, why do people want to avoid that information? A big part of it is coping. It's a stress management tool. People don't want to know these things because, well, they would obligate them to do things they don't want to ordinarily do. So they don't. Yeah, getting back to it though, there are a couple of things that we know are just generally good behaviors in terms of from health psych. And, don't smoke, don't drink, or if you do, drink in moderation and exercise regularly. All these also contribute to stress and coping. We know like alcohol consumption and smoking also tend to contribute to stress. I know a lot of people will say that, or you hear from smokers that smoking helps them calm down, but nicotine is a stimulant. It actually increases stress over time, kind of creates a self-fulfilling cycle, actually. So you end up, you smoke to calm down, and maybe the action gives you a little bit of relief, but the nicotine actually increases your heart rate and stress and all that, so you feel like you need to smoke more, and so on and so forth. So like I said, this is all easier said than done. We have people tend to be reluctant to change their current behaviors, and we also tend to be unrealistically optimistic about our levels of risk. So again, you have a little bit of a sniffle, it's probably just a cold. People in general tend to be unrealistically optimistic, and even if you know that maybe you've been exposed to somebody and you're showing some minor symptoms, you might go and say, hey, it's not COVID, I don't have COVID, it's fine, it's good. Also, you might not be able to do anything about it. Feeling powerless to make a change also contributes to people not wanting to do things. And sometimes it's, in general, when we think about, again, those health behaviors, it's usually easier to just not start those behaviors in the first place than to change them later on. So developing patterns and healthy habits overall tend to be easier than changing bad habits later on. All right. Well, that wraps up really the stress and coping part of this. We're gonna get more into health psych here. I'm just gonna take another break here. Any questions or anything? I mean, afterward, I'm gonna probably do office hours after this for a little bit as well. This is a little bit of a shorter chapter, but it's still a fun one. So I'm gonna give it a little bit here. So if you have any questions, now would be the time. All right, I guess I'll move on. All right. So complementary and alternative medicine, or CAMs. When we think about alternative medicine, we're thinking about something that is used in place of conventional medicine. Complementary medicine is used together with conventional medicine. Neither have been shown to be safe and effective by scientific standards, but there is an enormous amount of pseudoscience out there. Obviously, alternative medicine is probably worse overall because you're using it in place of something that has been shown to be scientifically consistent. But there's a lot of gray area and wiggle room here. It's a very complicated area to talk about. Ooh. So when we're thinking about the specifics, a lot of herbal supplements that people tend to attribute to have either a physiological or a psychological effect, well, don't tend to actually work. So stuff like St. John's wort, apple cider vinegar, shark cartilage, superfoods like ginkgo and acai berries and stuff tend to not necessarily have that big of effect on people's physical health. Even daily multivitamins, unless they've been prescribed, tend to not actually be that beneficial to most people because they have such high concentrations of vitamins that unless the person is experiencing a deficiency of something, your body tends to not know what to do with those high concentrations. It's kind of like if you've ever had those vitamin C things. My parents personally swear by them and send them to me all the time. The like emergency or like vitamin C supplements. It's like an orange powder that you make. It's like it's like Kool-Aid that's supposed to be healthy for you. Yeah, you mix it into water, you drink it. It's like 1,000% of your daily dose of vitamin C. They don't actually do anything really. It's kind of a fun story there, I guess. Because at the end of the day, you're taking so much vitamin C, your body can't actually do anything with it. You end up actually pissing most of it out. But my parents swear by it because, again, a lot of these confirmation biases tend to kick in and all that. So what's really fun about this, and you can check out this link if you'd like, or you can look for most of these. It turns out that in a lot of cases, especially in homeopathy, the supposed active ingredient might not even be present in the substance. It's a wild world out there because a lot of these aren't regulated by federal bodies. In the US, we have the FDA, which tends to give a stamp of approval when a medication is able to perform above the effect of a placebo or a sugar pill or a mock treatment. Well, turns out that a lot of these don't necessarily pass that muster and are not regulated by the FDA. So stuff like acai berries, or there's a big one also, pomegranates and pomegranate juice. There was a huge ad push a couple years ago to try to play up the superfood, the latest trend, pomegranate juice, as having these fantastical properties. Of course, it's not regulated by the FDA. It's just an ad campaign. And so there's these fantastical physiological and psychological benefits coming out from these companies, which are, of course, also trying to sell you the thing. So it's a messy world out there. When it comes down to other stuff like chiropractors that manipulate the spine to treat pain and illness, it can be somewhat effective for specific pain, but typically not more effective than exercise, relaxation, and physical therapy. What's interesting about meditation as another form of an alternative medicine is that for a long time, people discarded meditation. We'll talk about this when we get into counseling and therapy. But there is now new evidence, mostly in the mindfulness literature, suggesting that there are real positive outcomes in meditation. But other stuff like chakra readings and crystal readings and energy medicines that are using bioelectric fields and stuff, there's no scientific evidence here for this. And any effect that people see is likely a placebo. If you break it down, this is a fun thing that I dug up before this, trying to what is the substance beyond here? It's basically a lot of aura reading is mood rings for adults. You got these different colors, if you have a green aura, it supports balance and harmony. But if you have a red aura, that means you have physical energy and vitality and stamina, and so on and so forth. It's all just kind of thrown together. It's mood rings for adults, but it's still prolific. This stuff is all over the place. There's no shortage of people around, especially on the internet, that are going to sell you on aura reading and other alternative practices like this as being very legitimate, even sometimes maybe more robust than traditional science. Homeopathy, I did mention earlier as well. It's the idea of taking a harmful substance and then diluting it to a point where the original substance is probably not even present anymore. And it's sometimes when you go to organic markets and stuff, you'll see homeopathic cures, but don't waste your money. There's no evidence that they actually do anything. Now, the fun thing about sort of CAMs is that they generally don't outperform placebos, and this is one of the major obstacles that keeps them from getting, those that do pursue FDA accreditation, that keeps them from actually getting to that point. Because it turns out that one of the hardest hurdles that a person needs to conquer, or a medication needs to overcome in order to get FDA certification, is that it needs to be able to outperform a placebo. You need to, in a double-blind study, show that this medication is doing something over and above people just being told that they are being given a treatment when they're not. Because it turns out that a lot of factors that we experience, particularly pain, are highly psychological and are highly responsive to placebo treatments. So this is maybe one of the reasons why complementary and alternative medications, or CAMs, became so popular, because a lot of what we do experience is psychological, and if people expect that they are going to get better, they tend to get better. If you, in double-blind studies, a professional acupuncturist is weighted against someone who is just randomly placing needles in a person, and it turns out that they do about the same. I also really wonder how that study came about. Every now and then you come across a psychological finding and you're like, how did you get this through your IRB? How did you pitch this? Did you just go to your IRB chair or your institutional review board and say, all right, look, we got two groups. One group is going to have a professional acupuncture person. They're going to be putting needles in them. They're going to go through acupuncture. The other group, they're just going to get random needles placed wherever. And we're going to see what happens. You know, like, oh my God. I know I say this like every week and every time I do this, but sometimes I do think that there are people that get into psychology specifically so they can mess with people. So why are complementary and alternative medicines so popular? Well, turns out placebos are popular in general and are very powerful. In fact, actually so powerful that in some cases, they might actually perform as well, if not better, than most medications. The mind is incredibly powerful at managing certain conditions like pain, like I mentioned earlier. And for a while, we've thought about stuff like the placebo effect as being a sign of failure. But lately, people have started to realize if we can get the effect of a actual medication just by telling people that we're giving them a medication and then giving them a sugar pill, that's something that we can start to use and incorporate into treatment protocols. And so more modern medicines have started to incorporate the power of the expectation and the power of the placebo into their actual treatment protocols. It's some pretty wild stuff. So at the end of the day, our minds are very powerful and very capable of managing many number of conditions. So why, again, are CAMs popular, though? Getting back to the topic at hand, one problem is the confound of time. So it turns out that actually, well, you might be in a situation where the situation was misdiagnosed to begin with. So a person might have been diagnosed with, let's say, a person is diagnosed with early stage cancer. Misdiagnosed, in fact, and they pursue an alternative medicine or a complementary medicine course. So they end up eventually getting better. The cancer seems to go in remission, but they never had it in the first place. But then they attribute that to a miraculous cure brought about by the fact that they were taking like St. John's wort or something like that, when it's really just a normal recovery as a result of a misdiagnosis. Yeah, that's a very good comment. So the comment here is, I wonder about the degree of the impact of going on with alternatives for those of us living in a for-profit healthcare system. You know, comparing the medication at $2,000 a dose relative to an alternative at $10 a dose, actually a big factor. It's a huge factor. When we think about it, for those of us that live under a for-profit healthcare system, like in the wonderful US of A, that's another big point. It's like sometimes people can't actually access the traditional avenues, the scientific medicine, which creates a market for alternative and complementary medicines that are less expensive than, say, you know, like you said, like a medication that might cost you $2,000 a dose if you don't have insurance, relative to the alternative that might cost you $10. Whoa. Whoa. That's what I get for misclicking in OBS. So, yeah, stream starting soon. Get ready. So, basically, when it comes to these kinds of things, generally, if there's a lack of a scientific rationale, or it contradicts widely accepted scientific laws or principles, or if there are numerous peer-reviewed articles that are showing that this is not necessarily a conventional or effective treatment, just be skeptical. That's all I can ever say about anything. It's like if someone's reporting you a simple, miraculous cure for something, just be skeptical. And that's what I got for this week. This was a shorter one. It comes out like this is usually this is a one that I usually would teach in about 50 minutes or one class period. So yeah, but it's a fun one. I like being able to talk about stress and everything. It's always an interesting thing to revisit as well, because this is definitely a area that I had a lot of anecdotal experience with, but didn't have a lot of academic experience with. So when I, as a student, went through and was trying to learn about, you know, the psychology of stress and everything along there, I learned a lot about myself. I mean, what's the classic adage? Research is me search. That a lot of people end up doing research on stuff that is personally relevant for them, which might explain why My official on paper expertise is the social psychology of gender. And speaking of which, next time we meet, we're going to be talking about social psychology, the thing my degree is actually in. This is my actual doctorate. This is my actual expertise. Like I said, my official designation and expertise, my elevator talk, is that I am an expert in the social cognition of gender. So we're going to talk about social influence. We're going to talk about pro-social attitudes, helping and harming behaviors. We're going to talk about persuasion. And we're going to talk about prejudice and discrimination. That's going to be our focus next time we meet. It's going to be... Oh, God, I love this one. Oh, yeah, I love it. The bars. We're going to talk about the bars. Oh, yeah. Oh, I love this. We're going to talk about all the classics. We're going to talk about cults. We're going to talk about Milgram. We're going to talk about obedience. We're going to talk about social behaviors, persuasion, tricks. Oh, it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. Well, I hope you all had a good time. Yeah. If you've joined in halfway through or something, don't worry about it. I usually get these up on YouTube in a couple of days, usually. I'm going to try to get this up sometime tomorrow. So there's a link down there below if you want to check it out there. So I usually post stuff up there. These in particular I try to get up. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it. I usually, this is the part where I go and I hang out for a bit. So I'm actually going to go take a little bit of a break. I'm going to go over to my chatting screen and I am going to crack open an adult beverage of a sort and just chill for a bit and answer some questions. So hopefully I'll see you there. Bye.